So Diane, can you please introduce yourself?
I'm Diane Miller. I'm retired from the National Park Service, where for the last 25 years of my career I was managing the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program.
Very cool. So I'm going to ask you some questions. Let's start with what positions did you hold before managing the becoming the national program manager
Positions within the network.
within the network?
Um, so I started as the Midwest Regional Coordinator, and then for some amount of years or some time, I don't even remember how long, I was both the national coordinator and the regional coordinator
At the same time.
at the same time. And then it just got to be such a workload that we split out the regional coordinator.
Gotcha. And was the regional manager position the position that required you to move to Omaha, or were you already in Omaha when you took the Midwest Regional Manager?
I was already in Omaha.
Okay.
The Park Service had been reorganizing in the mid-90s, and the division I worked for in Washington, the longtime division chief retired, and they split the division up. And I was not real happy in the reorganization. So my husband and I decided that we wanted to just change and get out of DC. And so they had this thing called Operation Opportunity in the Park Service. They were trying to get people out of central offices and closer to the field. So that made it easier for me to move out to Omaha in the Midwest region, where they had recently added the National Register programs. They didn't used to do those out of Omaha, but they had just added that to the Omaha office, and so I was able to move out to work for that. So I was doing that before the network was established. So that I moved in 96, and then it was in 97 that Vincent DeForest, who had been working with Bob Stanton in the National Capital Region, came to all the regional offices and was talking about the Underground Railroad and trying to get Park Service programs and offices to focus projects on the Underground Railroad. Like if you're going to do a National Register nomination, do it for an Underground Railroad site, as opposed to something else. And they were trying to get a point of contact for each region to deal with Underground Railroad type projects. And that was as they were trying to get legislation, the Network to Freedom Act, through Congress. I was very interested in that history because that was history of enslavement was really kind of the topic that I was most interested in my historical studies. So I volunteered to be a point of contact. And since they had been out having meetings in different locations and meeting with community people about Underground Railroad sites, doing a special resource study where they were visiting all these places, Underground Railroad communities started to get really excited, and they were contacting the Park Service and wanting to connect with us. And so I started fielding those kinds of calls and things in the Midwest region. And then the legislation passed like a year later. And so I was just there. I kind of became a regional coordinator. The Midwest was really active in the Underground Railroad, particularly like Ohio and Michigan. And there were groups on the ground there, sort of organized statewide groups of volunteers that were documenting their Underground Railroad history. They had sent church buses to DC with full of people to attend the hearings on the legislation. One of them even testified for the legislation. So when that passed, they were like ready. They hit the ground running. They were wanting to get started. So I would get these calls. What are we supposed to do? The Park Service hadn't stood up the program yet. Nobody knew what it really looked like. And so I would go to my boss and say, well, what are we supposed to do? What is Washington telling us to do? What do I tell people when they call? And there was no guidance coming out of Washington. So I just kept trying to get answers and trying to get answers. And eventually that led to the regional directors who would regularly have calls with each other, getting together and deciding, well, maybe the program should be operated out of a region. And remember, this is the time frame when the Park Service is trying to move decision making down closer to the ground, closer to where the resources are. And so the regional directors collectively said to the Cultural Resources Associate Director in Washington, we want to take this program. And Bob Stanton was director at the time, and that's what ended up happening. They allowed that to happen. So then it was on the regions to figure out, well, how do we answer these questions? So we got together a meeting in Omaha in like early February of '99 or something, with representatives from all the regions to figure out what we should do. And the Midwest Regional managers, director, deputy director, associate cultural director, they were all part of these discussions. And the sense of the people in that meeting was that we really needed to have people on the ground to meet with these communities, to visit these sites, to give technical assistance, to help them figure out how to preserve and interpret the story. And so the sense was that we should not contract out to get National Register nominations or something. We should have staff people that can work with communities and, help to uncover and elevate the history. And so that's kind of how it came to the regions, and how the regions kind of decided that that would be the approach. It wasn't going to be, let's just contract for some National Register nominations or an NHL study or NHL nominations. We're going to actually work with the communities. And so because the Midwest region had a lot of active Underground Railroad communities and work, and the Northeast had some, but the Midwest regional directors seemed to kind of take the lead on some of these negotiations. And I was there as a staff person, and the contact coordinator in the Northeast was what we had support office superintendents. So kind of like a deputy regional director, sort of. We don't have a position like that in the Park Service anymore. But anyway, he was sort of more of a manager level, so I was more available to do the grunt work, basically. So that's kind of how the Midwest ended up sort of coordinating the work to begin with.
Gotcha. So when Vincent DeFlores and Bob Stanton came to each of the regions, that's when you met Bob Stanton for the first time?
Bob didn't come on that. It was just Vincent. The first time I remember talking to Bob Stanton was in the Midwest Regional Director's office, shortly after we had sort of taken the lead for organizing things. We were on a call with Bob. So this was a long time ago, right? Speakerphones weren't great, but we were all huddled around the speakerphone on the regional director's office desk, like the regional director, the deputy regional director, the associate regional director for cultural resources, and me, like all huddled over the speakerphone, listening to Bob on the other side. The thing I remember Bob saying about that was, at that time, was that he was going to direct all of the regional directors to make this a priority, to put some resources toward it, and that he was going to find the $500,000 that we were authorized as an annual operating budget. We were authorized too late in the whole budget process to get the funding that year, but he was going to find it elsewhere so we would have funds to operate on. That's what I remember out of that first phone call. But I didn't meet Bob in person, I don't think, until 2000, September of 2000, when we had our launch event in Philadelphia, where we launched the logo and our website and the process and the application form to start listing things in the network. So it took us like a year and a half to figure all of that stuff out. And so we planned an event with the National Parks Conservation Association in Philadelphia, and we had a outdoor event in Independence Square. We had an event at Mother Bethel Church. We had sort of a banquet. There were like 4 or 5 different things that happened throughout the day, and Bob was there and sort of emceed all of them, and that's the first time I met him, but I didn't really have any particular one-on-one contact with him at that point. I think really I didn't get to know him very well until after he left the Park Service. He would periodically send me email messages with questions, oh, I'm giving a talk in Texas. What do we know about the Underground Railroad in Texas or wherever? And so I would, like I would do with any email I got, but particularly for Bob, who was the former director, try to give as much thorough information as I could. So I always tell him, these are the sites that we have in the network. These are the people that are on the ground that are doing the work. These are some other stories that we know about, we may not have listed yet. And so I'd always give him, these pretty thorough replies with all this information. And so he kept coming back and asking for information.
So he was always very supportive of the program?
Always. Always. I think the Network to Freedom was one of the accomplishments of his directorship that he was proud of, along with adding new parks to the National Park System for African American history sites. But he, from the very beginning, was a huge supporter for the Network to Freedom. And I don't remember the first thing we asked him to do, but whenever we would have a conference, we would ask him to come and MC the banquet or the luncheons, or do some kind of speaking role for us. And he always did. Anytime we ever asked him to do anything like that, he always came. And so through that, I guess we kind of got to know each other more, and so we still remain in contact.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So with the establishment of the network, and you said, people were coming to the legislation and things, were you involved in the political side of any way? Did you go to listen to the testimonies and things like that?
I did not, because at that time I was sort of a point of contact, but I wasn't really closely involved with it. Mm-hmm. A couple of years later, there was legislation to establish a grant program for the Network to Freedom, and I do remember going to hearings for that. We happened to have been having a meeting in Washington while the hearings were going on, and so I do remember going to those hearings. I didn't speak or anything, I just was listening.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Answer that question. So as someone who's with the program from day one and before, what were some of the major milestones in standing up the program, as well as in its evolution and development over the next 25 years?
Well, I think the first milestone would have been the launch event where we revealed the logo. And, and it was kind of funny because, this was supposed to be this, big reveal, and we had it up on the stage with the drape over it and everything, but we had it blown up, to poster size at Kinko's, and early that morning, the team members that went to pick it up were like carrying it down the street, and it was all open and visible. Now, I'm sure nobody had a clue what it was or cared, but we're like, oh wait, that's not supposed to be shown. But anyway, that was, I think, another milestone really was just the first round of applications and getting the first listings. And I remember one of the applicants was Carol Murphy from Murphy's Orchard in New York. And she came down to visit, to see the meeting, because we did have them open to the public. And since she had come all the way from New York, we decided we would do her application first. And we accepted it, so that was kind of cool. Now, all these many years later, she has since passed away. And a lot of the people that we worked with in those early days have passed away. So it's kind of bittersweet and sad to think about, some of the really amazing people that I met through this job that are gone now. Other milestones, probably when we got the grant program. We had kind of reached an impasse, a bit of a dilemma, because we had gotten to the point where, due to the staff getting to full performance level, cost of living adjustments, step increases, we couldn't cover payroll anymore. And so we had actually 7 people on the staff, 6 regional coordinators and a national person. And one of the regional coordinators left. And the Western region, so we were trying to figure out, how are we going to cover all of this? At the same time, we were trying to make these positions permanent, because most of them were collateral duty for people, or they were on a detail and they weren't permanently Underground Railroad coordinators. And so trying to get the Pacific West to agree to make their person permanent, they are like, we do not want to risk having to cover any salary. Like, even if we have to pay $1 of salary, we're not willing to do it. And so we said, okay, we just lost the Intermountain person. What if we combine those 2 regions and not fill that one position, that give us a little more room? And so that's how the Intermountain and Pacific West regions became combined. But then we still ended up in a budget crisis. And we, as a team, got together and thought of different ways we could, address that. Like, maybe we just stop doing the program, or maybe we see if we can get a budget increase from Washington, or maybe we figure out our deficit and divide it up by all the regions and everybody puts in a little bit. The regional directors at one of their quarterly or annual meetings talked about it, and they decided that, we couldn't just stop doing the program. We should try to get an increase to our base funding, and we needed to do what they called at the time a core operation evaluation. So we did that, and that became justification to increase our operating budget. So we put in the budget request. At the same time, National Parks Conservation Association, Alan Spears, who works for them, they took on lobbying Congress to increase our base funding. So we had gotten authority for grants for $2 million, and our operational funding was $500,000. The grants were supposed to be matching grants, and at the time, I didn't think there was $2 million of match out there in the communities that we were working with to ever actually grant the $2 million, even if it had been funded. So the strategy was to switch those amounts so that we had $2 million authorized for operations and $500,000 for grants. And so that was the hearing that I was able to attend. That succeeded, and so we now had a higher authorization level. Therefore, we could get more money in our annual appropriation, but that didn't mean the money was coming. I think we got like $63,000 increase or something. It kind of kept the wolves away. So that was a milestone, though, because we did have that higher level of funding. At the same time, we got in 2000 money appropriated for grants, $500,000, and I'm not totally sure how it happened. Joe Biden was a senator from Delaware at the time, and he had an earmark in for $250,000 for the Underground Railroad Coalition of Delaware. Somehow, out of the sausage making, it came out on the other side as $500,000 for grants for Network to Freedom, half of which was earmarked for Delaware. So Delaware got their money, but so did everybody else, and that was our first round of grant funding. The agency never requested it again. They didn't request it in the first time, but they never requested it again. When they do the budget every year, they take the budget you have this year, and then they subtract and add. The Park Service always subtracted the grant money. 3 more times Congress actually officially gave us grant money. In fact, Senator Mike DeWine, when he was in Ohio, sent a letter to the Park Service saying, I really want to give grant money for this, but you guys got to ask for it. And they never would ask for it. So anyway, we did have 4 years of actual grants appropriated. After that, when it was clear that that wasn't going to happen, Michael Sheen was the Midwest Regional Director at the time, and he suggested maybe we could use some of our operational money to do grants. So we did that. We didn't have a whole lot of money, mind you, because we'd just been through this whole we can't pay salaries. But the Midwest region had started supplementing our budget with like $50,000 to cover travel, and they would round up any pennies that weren't spent at the end of the year and put it in, help give it to us to put in a cooperative agreement to do grants the next year. So you see, if you look at our grant funding, odd amounts of dollars, like $163,000 or something like that, that was the pennies that were scraped off the top at the end of the year that nobody was going to be able to use. That's how we funded grants for a while. And then the last several years, we started getting pretty big sized increases to our funding. Alan Spears, yet again, was meeting with a congressman from Virginia who was really wanting to find ways to support African American history in the Park Service, and Alan suggested the Network to Freedom. So I got a call out of the blue from the congressman's staff person saying they want to put in a request to give more money to the network. So I gave them some information. So that happened about 2 years in a row. Now, I've been told since then by John Meade that at that time the Northeast region was trying to request for more funding. I never actually saw anything about that. Nobody ever talked to me about it, so I don't know. But maybe they did. The happy thing is that we started getting more money. And in 2022, I guess, or 23. It's kind of a blur the last few years. We actually got $2.5 million, which was our full authorized amount. It was a complete shock. I had no idea it was coming, and we didn't know until like March, which is really late in the fiscal year when all of the funding deadlines to spend your money start happening at the end of June or the beginning of June. But we decided to add more staff positions. So in addition to regional coordinators, and by that time we had a visual information specialist, but we wanted to add a few more support positions and fully fund the grant program. And so that's kind of where things ended up, funding-wise.
Go ahead.
Okay. What were the most important and fulfilling projects you were involved with? Which resonated most with you?
One of the things I'm most proud about is the development of the logo. I had said earlier that the first year the program was established, Director Stanton found the money so that we would have money for our first year. And that was before the regions had taken ownership of the program. The Associate Cultural Resources Director in Washington decided to do a cooperative agreement with the National Park Foundation with half of that money, on the understanding that the Park Foundation would use that as seed money to leverage a match. They never did actually do that. One of the things they did, they were going to develop the logo. And I remember going to a meeting with them in Washington, and the rest of the coordinators were there. And Brian Joyner, who is now, I think, deputy superintendent in the mall or someplace in DC, was working for the Park Foundation. He came in with a fax from this media company of some logo ideas. I could tell the second he stepped through the door, this was a disaster. They were all like railroad crossing signs and tracks and trains. There was like a little happy caboose train that you'd see in a kid's book, or a streamline, Art Deco train, or, the best one was stairs with an arrow pointing down and train tracks at the bottom. Oh my God. And we were like, oh no, no, this is not gonna do. So the regional coordinators decided that we would work on the logo development, and we were able to get a few dollars to hire a graphic designer to develop the logo. And we talked about it as a team, like what kind of symbolism should we include? Should there be chains in it? Should there, be railroad track reference? Should there be stars, or should there be hands? The whole idea of like hands of different colors coming together, or all of these kinds of things we talked through. And then how we would use it. It needed to be something that we could photocopy and a million times, and it wouldn't degrade, if you could still understand that it was what it was. That it could be printed really big or really small, or used in different ways, put on a bronze plaque, or whatever. And so we gave all that information to the designer, and she came back with some ideas, and one of them was the logo that we're using. And I think it has been well received. Many people have told me that they really like it. And I actually saw what I think was sort of a knockoff copycat of it in a museum for the Strategic Air Command Museum in Offutt Air Force Base. They use like the contrails of planes as anyway. That I was one of the things that I was most proud of, and I think to me part of what makes that logo so powerful, and is part of what I think is the best thing about the Network to Freedom, is that it brings humanity back into the Underground Railroad. You know, it really conveys that sense of yearning for freedom, for self-determination. It's focusing on the freedom seeker. And I think that's what the Network to Freedom program has been about. I think it has taken the Underground Railroad from sort of an academic exercise about a bunch of abolitionists and really refocused it on the freedom seeker and that determination for freedom, you know, as well as the people that were allies and helpers and assistants and conductors and all of that. So I guess that's probably what I would say.
Work in the space can be challenging. Any difficult experience you'd like to share?
It can be really challenging to be a white woman working in African American history. I remember many years before the network was even dreamed of, speaking with a woman who had done African American history, and she was saying there's just no future in African American history for a white woman. But honestly, I haven't had a huge amount of trouble with that, because I think if you talk to people, if they understand that you're truly interested in the history, that you're sincere about it, that you're really not trying to tell it with a white bias or uplifting only the white people, that you're really trying to tell a full story. Most people that I've worked with have accepted that. They don't really seem to have a huge amount of problem. Maybe they do and they haven't they've hit it well. But I mean, I've worked with a lot of people of all types, all groups. And I think because they sense that I'm sincerely interested in this history and wanting to know the truth, and I feel like I've gotten a lot of acceptance. And I remember one of our partners, Pixico, Pompey Pixico from Los Angeles, who's Black Seminole, telling me that he thought it was actually important to have somebody from the dominant culture to be involved with this history, because that would make other people from the dominant culture pay more attention to it. That if it was just African Americans or Native Americans telling their own history, it's easier to put it in a silo and not pay attention. Like it's their history, it belongs to them, it doesn't belong to us, it doesn't matter to us, it doesn't affect us. But if you have somebody from the dominant culture that says, no, this is really important, it makes people think about it a little differently.
So kind of thinking about that and like those people who were impactful leaders in the communities you met, do you have a memorable experience with them?
Oh boy, so many. It's hard to know where we start. I'm thinking of people now that we've lost. Kathy Nelson in Ohio, who organized the Ohio Underground Railroad Association, which was a statewide organization. They had representatives of all counties, and they documented hundreds of sites around Ohio. Mary Edmond, who did similar thing in Michigan, Jerry Gore from Kentucky, who is a descendant of freedom seeker who used to do tours and had an Underground Railroad museum in Maysville. I think about Barbara Wood from St. Louis. She was a professor at St. Louis University in the African American Studies program, and she actually started a friends group for the Network to Freedom, and that was about the time that Alan Spears was trying to work on getting our funding increased, and so she was able to help get people from around the country to, talk to their congressional representatives. She passed away, though, many years ago from cancer. Judy Wellman in New York, who organized county-wide Underground Railroad surveys and got dozens and dozens of sites listed in the network. Kate Larson, who did the biography of Tubman and got dozens of sites listed in Maryland. Cheryl Brown from Los Angeles, or Riverside, who published a black newspaper and developed a week-long bus tour for teachers to go through Kentucky, Ohio to Canada for them to learn about the Underground Railroad, to go back to teach their students. And she published a supplement to their newspaper of the Underground Railroad in California. There's just been so many and really amazing people I've just been honored and privileged to have met over the years.
I didn't know you, right?
No,
Yeah.
no,
Okay.
it's up to you.
So thinking about that and in those, avenues, can you, again, thinking about raising the profile of the network, in the focus of it, what avenues were more productive, what avenues weren't as productive for raising?
Honestly, one of the more productive things I think we did was our conferences. People still talk to me about them, but it helped to make community among the people scattered around the country that feel like they're laboring and, in silence by themselves. But it also brought attention from scholars. There would be a place they could go and present research about the Underground Railroad. They could interact with the community researchers who frankly often did way better research than the scholars did. So, and the scholars, though, they did bring a lot of perspective and contextualization to the research, so it really was very fruitful both ways. And I think it created a little bit of buzz in those places. I think that was actually one of the most productive things we've done. Almost impossible to do anymore bureaucratically, but they were really valuable. I am trying to think of other things that worked or didn't work. I don't know.
Sounds like the community reaching out to the congressional districts was a good avenue of them kind of taking it upon themselves.
Right. And, it was really important that these Congress people knew that they had this history in their communities. I think what would be really impactful would be if there could be a friends group that got off the ground. There were 2 or 3 efforts that failed miserably, crashed and burned in big ways. And it's a challenge because people are scattered all over the place. These are people that have day jobs that don't involve the Underground Railroad. They do this work because they love it and it is meaningful to them. But they do it like in their spare time. They don't have the bandwidth to then yet start another group at a national level. And they don't have the resources to do that. And so it's been difficult to make that work. But I think that if that could happen, I think that would be a game changer. There's a lot of support for the Underground Railroad, a lot of interest. The Freedom Center in Cincinnati has sucked up millions of dollars. People with deep pockets think that's the only game in town. I think if they realized that the Network to Freedom existed, if there was an organization that could actively raise funds for Underground Railroad work, I think it would be easy to raise money. But, you know, obviously as a federal agency, the Park Service can't do that, and we don't have a friends group, which would have been supremely helpful.
Do you want a break?
Yeah, I don't know. How many more questions?